I'm Elliot Chodoff, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. Hi, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered. I'm Elliot Chodoff. With me is my good friend and colleague, Uslan, and we are continuing along the long road to October 7th. Zev, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Elliot. I feel like I'm watching a serial, excellent TV show where we're progressing towards the conclusion slowly and thoroughly towards October 7th. And last podcast, we talked about the small army and Ehud Barak bringing us up through, I think, about 2000. And so I'm anxiously awaiting our next stage, our next conversation, so we can get closer and closer of understanding to October 7th.
Okay, well, here the conclusion isn't the mystery; it's how we got there that's the mystery. So let's go back. I mentioned Ehud Barak when he was chief of staff and his determination to create the small, clever army. And I want to spend a few minutes on that because that concept will become part of Israeli military and political leadership thinking and budgetary thinking up until October 7th. So first and foremost, the idea in and of itself, as an idea, has a lot to say for it. A small army is cheaper. It's more efficient, and we talked about the efficiency experts sort of moving in. It fits into the mindset of we're moving toward peace. We don't need this big, heavy army anymore. We don't need to call up reservists in any large numbers because it's disruptive, as we've seen since October 7th, how disruptive it can be to have to rely on the reserve component, disruptive to life, disruptive to the economy. So better not to call them. Training them also is very expensive, and we can cut all of that out. And something that is also near and dear, not only to Ehud Barak, but also to a mindset in Israel, the high-tech land of the startups. You replace people with technology. Now, I want to start really from there before I even get into the military aspect. As you know, and people who've heard me lecture and teach know, I am devoutly low tech.
Are
I
you
still
speaking
navigate
personally
on
or
the moon.
professionally?
Yes. Personally, low tech. Not that there's no need for technology, not that there's no use for technology, but I'm low tech. I navigate with the sun, the moon, and the stars. I use a map, a compass on a bad day, and GPS and I have a mutual hate-hate relationship where it is constantly trying to get me to turn my car into the water somewhere.
Thus, you are a wandering Jew.
Indeed. And my GPS now on my phone shows that I'm in Amman because we're jamming GPS in the north. So, without being facetious, there are a few things we need to understand, and I'm going to come back and say this again because I think it's important. Technology has its place, and its use has its place. However, having said that, every generation of humanity since the first generation, since Adam, has said we are in a new technological era.
And he had an Apple, too.
and he had an apple, and look where it got him. Okay. Uh, Whatever the harnessing or the invention, fire, the wheel, the arrow was a leap forward in technology, and we can track the rise of technology and the curve and all of that. I will argue that the more advanced technology becomes, the shorter its shelf life. And therefore, reliance on it actually becomes more precarious as it goes up. Okay, one of the most heavily used weapons in the world today in 2026 is what the Americans call the 50 caliber machine gun, which is a post World War One weapon. It's over 100 years old, and nothing has been found to improve on it. For World War II movie aficionados, those are the guns that the B-17s mounted. They were the guns that the P-51 Mustangs mounted in their wings. They were carried on tanks. They were carried by infantry, mounted on ships, etc. And we still do. And we still use them. And the U.S. military still uses them, uh, over 100 years old. They work. Now, is that the only answer? No, things have progressed in over 100 years. But, and here's the important but to come back, reliance on technology as the panacea means that somebody on the other side is going to figure out a way around it, one way or the other. And today, as we sit and discuss this, Hezbollah in Lebanon is using 1970s technology drones with unreeling fiber optic cables 10 kilometers long to attack Israeli troops and civilians along the northern border, troops in South Lebanon. And there's no electronic counter to it because they're not electronic. They are fiber optic cable. So the most advanced drones today can be jammed, but the 50-year-old ones can't be, 40-year-old, whatever. And this points to a problem in the reliance on technology. Now, I mentioned that as an illustration. So the idea is we're going to have a high-tech, professional, elite, and this also speaks very heavily to Ehud Barak, the ex-commando, and all due respect, commander of Sayeret Matkal, the top special forces unit in the Israeli army. It all suits him very well. And as I said, it suits the society for budgetary reasons, for mentality reasons, uh, for social reasons, etc. There are only a couple of problems with it, and they're big problems. Napoleon, who knew a little bit about warfare, famously said, God favors the big battalions. In other words, ultimately, when push comes to shove, you want to be bigger when you're doing the shoving. And it means that you have more power, you have more firepower, you have more ability to absorb damage and still maintain a cohesive, capable fighting force. It allows you more flexibility. And I'll come back to that perhaps in a later uh, discussion. What happens if you cut the size of your small units? But it gives you flexibility. It allows you to use your units simultaneously in fire and maneuver. In other words, part fires, part maneuvers. And if you reduce the size below a certain level, you can't do both because you just don't have enough. I'm going to digress for a moment because this is not a uniquely Israeli phenomenon. It actually parallels an American phenomenon of the same period for different reasons, although with a lot of similar thinking to it. When the Soviet Union fell in the immediate aftermath, The United States military had about 500,000 personnel that were no longer needed for the mission of containing the Soviet Union or defending against it. Shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and conquered it. And America decided to drive him out, and it sent a force to Saudi Arabia of, do you want to guess how many personnel? 500,000.
Okay. I was going to guess wrong. Okay.
In other words, the force that was no longer needed in Europe could now be deployed to the Middle East. I'm being overly simplistic, but force has a certain fungible quality to it. If you have it, you can move it and shift it around. You can use other force knowing that you have this in reserve and so on and so forth. Having said that, let me just mention as an aside, the Vietnam War was fought by draftees because there was no surplus force in the U.S. military. So they had to draft an army to fight in Southeast Asia, while the main army stood on the barricades, so to speak, in Europe, waiting for the Soviet attack that never came. Okay, so 1991, that's different. They don't need to draft anybody. They have this force in place. Bill Clinton comes into office, and there are two philosophies at the time approaching the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. There's one exemplified by a Harvard professor named Samuel Huntington, who wrote an article and then a book called A Clash of Civilizations. And I don't want to go into a long analysis of the book. I'm a great fan of Huntington. I actually met him a couple of times when I was in graduate school. Brilliant, 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 brilliant professor. And the point of A Clash of Civilizations, which is missed by many people, probably because they never read the book, is not declaring so much what would be in terms of civilizations clashing, as much as raising the important question, now that the Soviet-American conflict has ended, where will the next fault lines of conflict be in the world? And he posited civilizations, but that really wasn't his point. His point was that international conflict is endemic, and let's try to identify where those fault lines are going to be. He was greatly derided by the left, the liberals, as a warmonger, because the other perspective was put out by another scholar named Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man, in which he posited a much nicer view that now the Soviet Union has fallen, we are no longer going to have to fight wars. History is over. The Messianic age has come without the Messiah. Very similar to the Oslo process concept, which we talked about last time. And at the same time, we're talking same years, the Clinton administration bought into Fukuyama, as did many. First of all, let's be honest, and here uh, it'll sound cynical, but truthfully, I prefer Fukuyama's view of the world to Huntington's. I just didn't agree with it. Okay, just as I prefer the peace movement, let's all be friends, no, just be nice and it's all going to work, to my view of the world. Not that I'm against peace, but my view of the world's a little more pessimistic than that. Their view is more optimistic. I wish they were right. Likewise with Fukuyama. What happens is, to make a very long story short, is that over the course of the Clinton administration, Clinton does something perfectly understandable, perfectly reasonable, and absolutely wrong. And that is that he cuts 500,000 troops out of the U.S. military personnel. In other words, by the end of the Clinton administration, those 500,000 troops that went to Kuwait are not there anymore. And the U.S. military has gone from 1.8 to 1.3 million. This bites them after 9/11. And here I actually blame George W. Bush for this more than I do Clinton, because Clinton, as I said before, made a mistake, but a reasonable, understandable, fatally wrong mistake. When W gets up in front of the people in the United States after 9/11, instead of dusting off Franklin Roosevelt's Pearl Harbor speech and saying, "We're at war. This is a day that will live in infamy. We are fighting a difficult enemy on many fronts. I need more people in my military. I need more budget. I need war bonds. I need whatever." He says, "Go shopping. We'll take care of it." And the U.S. military now goes to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, 500,000 under strength that he could have filled in the days after 9/11. I guarantee you that had he thrown open the recruitment offices and said, "My fellow Americans, I need to fill out the ranks," they would have been lined up around the blocks in September 2001. But he doesn't do it. And what he tries to do in Iraq, and this is a long way up to this, or actually, I'm going to skip what he tries to do. What he ends up doing is burning out the U.S. military's reserves and National Guards, which were never meant to do what they did over the 20 years after 9/11. Repeated call-ups, repeated deployments overseas, and so on and so forth. What they try to do in 2003 in Iraq is do it on the cheap. And I emphasize this because this is what the IDF is going to try to do for the next 25 years until plus almost 30. Yes.
I have what I think is a relevant question, but if it's not, then discount it. You had said one of the reasons that the small, effective army was popular was because it saved money. And the inflation in the 80s was horrific. If I recall right, in the 90s, we started to do much, much better. And by the 2000s, we were
Yes.
blossoming. Did that have an impact on spending more for
No.
idea? Oh.
No, because the dividend was in social. There's a concept in economics called guns or butter. In other words, your money goes either into domestic consumer goods or into the military. And I'll come back to that in a moment because it's also a very important point that applies to the United States as well. When America goes into Iraq, it tries to do it on the cheap. And there's an excellent book by Atkinson called In the Company of Soldiers. Atkinson is an historian, has written some excellent history, including a very famous trilogy, the Liberation Trilogy on World War II. And he was embedded with the 101st Airborne Division in Iraq with their headquarters. The 101st Airborne at the time was commanded by General Petraeus, who you can like or not like and think whatever you think about him, but a brilliant man, ends up with 4 stars. I mean, a very, very serious officer. And I'm not going to ruin the book because it's a great book in and of itself, but Petraeus at one point, in Petraeus, the 101st Airborne Division, he's an elitist, hardcore elite. He says to Atkinson, sometimes quantity has a quality all its own. And he says it in reference to the fact that they don't have enough troops on the ground in Iraq. And that leads to a follow-up of what's called the surge. This is after the 03. Why does there have to be a surge? Because there wasn't enough to begin with. And this idea that you can get away with it on the cheap is enticing. It's attractive. It makes a good argument right up until you have to get out there and start shooting. And it fades into the background. Another thing about budgeting, you raise the question, and it's very important, and again, it's true in the U.S. as well, and I've had this discussion with American lawmakers. Military spending is like buying insurance. And what makes buying insurance really interesting when you think about it is that you're betting against yourself, right? You buy something in the hope that you're going to waste your money, because the only way you can come out ahead in buying insurance is if something bad happens.
Right.
Kind of nutty way of seeing the world, but that's what it is, right? You buy insurance for your car and hope that at the end of the year you haven't used it and you've wasted the money, and then next year you waste the same amount of money in the hope that you're not going to use it. Military spending is exactly the same. And the error in military spending, which most of us don't make when we buy insurance, is to say, oh, there was no war last year, we can spend less this year. And there was no war this year, so we can spend less next year to bring it down to a minimum. And we'll cut a little here, and there's always fat. By the way, they're always talking about cutting the fat out of the military. We want it lean and hard. As systems don't work that way. Lean and hard means you're starving. And this was the thinking that carried through, once again, because after 1982, the IDF never mobilizes for a large-scale war again until after October 7th. And when you're mobilizing only partially, as we did in 2006, you can delude yourself into thinking that if I only mobilize a third of my force or a quarter of my force, and I use all of the support services that I have to maintain that third of the force, I'm doing fine, because look how much I've saved. But what happens when you have to mobilize all of it? And none of that is taken into account. It wasn't taken into account in the United States. It wasn't taken into account in Israel. The difference,
The
of course,
industrial or organizational psychologists who had served, and I assume were academics at this point, didn't have a model for conveying that.
because once again, the military model is different from the industrial model. You know, let me generalize it for a moment. The nonprofit model, organizational model, is different from the profit-making corporation model. It's different economically. It's different structurally. It's different. Within the governmental model, there are also institutions that are separate. They're called total institutions, typically prisons, military. The police falls sort of into that as well. But it's not just violence. There's actually an argument that says the educational system falls into it as well. Okay, without getting into the details of it. In other words, there are systems that you look at and say, these are different from building roads. Okay, you need to be expert in those types of systems, and of those, the military is unique, because the military is always preparing for some hypothetical future conflict that's purely hypothetical. Now, do you go worst case scenario? Do you go mid case scenario? What do you? These are debates that go on constantly, and there is no correct answer. I would argue that in a country like Israel, you can't afford to take it lightly. You can in the United States. America is not going to be invaded by anybody. Israel? Okay. So you've got this picture that is now formed by the budget cuts, by the efficiency, and now feeding into this, we're going to have a small, high-tech, professional army, which, as I said, not only speaks to the budget, but it speaks to the Israeli mentality, the startup nation mentality. We're the whiz kids. we're going to find the device that's going to do this and it's going to do that, and we're going to build the biggest and the fastest and the cleverest ever. And you know what? In a lot of things we really do. One of the problems here also with military technology is that there's somebody on the other side working to thwart it. Okay? That's very different from commercial technology where a competitor might be trying to outdo it, but not thwart it in the direct sense. In medical technology or anything dealing with nature, but let's say medical technology for our purpose, there is no sinister thinker on the other side trying to undo it. Now, yes, granted, diseases, viruses mutate and they try to beat the system, but it's not the same thing as some guy sitting across from you saying, you built this, I'm building the countermeasure for it. Very specific, focused, and this is the way I'm going to do it. And I may be doing it by high-teching you, I may be doing it by negating you, and I might be doing it by low-teching you. Okay, one of the ways that Yahya Sinwar of Hamas was able to pass his orders around to his people before October 7th against the most electronically advanced intelligence system perhaps in the world is by writing his orders on pieces of paper and having people carry them by hand to the people receiving the orders. In other words, he beat the system in the good old-fashioned way. He didn't block and he didn't electronic and he didn't.
He
No,
didn't
he
use
said, okay, here.
He didn't use pagers either.
They didn't use pagers. They didn't use cell phones. They went totally low tech and as a result went totally dark. I'm getting ahead of myself, but the idea here that you can beat it all with technology is extremely problematic because you always have to keep in mind that somewhere along the way, someone else is thinking about how to beat it. And it's a very nice article written 30 some odd years ago, maybe even longer, called the optimal use of surprise or some such thing. It's not the exact title. But if you have a secret weapon, when is the optimal time to use it? Because once you use it, it will no longer be secret. And the minute you use it and it's no longer secret, its effectiveness begins to degrade, etc. So this is the military that is going into the turn of the century, 2000. We mentioned last time, toward the end of the 90s, pressure in Lebanon. Hezbollah is attacking Israeli troops in South Lebanon in the security zone. It's becoming a major pressure situation in Israel. Ehud Barak runs for prime minister in 1999 on the campaign promise, that if he becomes prime minister, he will pull out of Lebanon within a year. He's elected in July, and in May, because the army is already beginning to fold in Lebanon, it collapses. Hezbollah drives us out in May, 2 months early. But we're all home, we're all back, we're not in Lebanon anymore. And we have the mythology of Ehud Barak's doctrine. We're here and they're there. Now we have no reason for anybody to bother us. And I'm going to conclude with this because we're running up on our time. We're here and they're there is a very enticing part of Israeli thinking in the sense that it reduces, and this goes back to Oslo as well, it reduces the conflict to a territorial conflict. It's all about territories for peace. We're going to give them territory, and they're going to give us peace. And if we give them territory, they'll have no reason to come after us anymore. Now, it's very enticing because it's extremely uncomfortable, extremely difficult psychologically to believe that our enemies hate us because of who we are and what we are, and not because of what we're doing or what we've done. Being hated for who you are is disempowering. There is nothing you can do about it. Being hated for what you've done is empowering because I can now do something to get you to stop hating.
Vis-a-vis the Sinai.
Vis-a-vis the Sinai. Now, what's interesting and I think very important and is missed for whatever reason, the Egypt that goes to war with Israel in 1948 is the Egypt of the corrupt monarchy under Farouk. The Egypt that Israel fights in the 50s and 60 up to through 67 and the war of attrition in 70 is Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt, which is ideologically driven by Nasser as a pan-Arabist. In other words, for him, there's the Middle East is the Arab world. There's no room for Israel because Israel is not an Arab country. So he hates Israel for ideological reasons, not Islamic reasons, but ideological reasons. He dies in 1970, and Anwar Sadat takes over as president. Anwar Sadat was an Egypt-centric thinker. In other words, for him, Egypt was more important than pan-Arabism. Egypt was more important than Islamism. And after the war in 1973, he realizes the easiest way for him to resolve all of this is make peace with Israel and get Sinai back. In other words, the idea here of territory for peace is not universally false, but it's very specific to a particular system for whom that currency works. It doesn't work for Hamas. It doesn't work for Hezbollah. It doesn't work for Iran. It didn't work for Assad's Syria because the Baathists of Syria were very similar to, I'm oversimplifying, to the Nasserists. It can work, but it doesn't have to work. And to turn the whole thing into a paradigm of territory for peace is trying to make a Western territorial conflict out of what is fundamentally an ideological conflict. And that also begins to change the mindset of strategic thinking in Israel. All we need to do is give them a little of this, give them a little of that, and give them a little something else, and everything's going to work out. So let's leave it on that note. We're about to step into what is commonly referred to as the Second Intifada. I refer to the terrorist war of 2000. And that's what we're going to pick up along our road next time in a military that has begun to shift its thinking and its structure and its training away from classical warfare to its detriment.
Elliot, thank you. And I look forward to the next conversations. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. To our listeners, thanks for being with us. And as always, stay safe, stay engaged. Thank you for listening to Conflict Uncovered. As always, it's been another rough day in the Middle East. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share and recommend with your friends, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. For more in-depth analysis and exclusive content, join our community and follow us on social media. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to explore the critical issues shaping the Middle East and the world. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.